I know the Star Wars Extended Universe treats spice like it's this big scary drug, but I kinda like to imagine that it's basically just space weed, and the only reason Han got in trouble with the Imperials over Jabba's cargo is that he was evading import tariffs. If we're just looking at mentions in the original trilogy, is there evidence it's even a drug and not something you put on bland food to make it taste like something? What if Han was just carrying a cargo of like cilantro, mint, etc., none of which grow on Tatooine and are thus highly expensive and heavily taxed commodities? I am fully prepared to believe that the infamous Han Solo ended up in a life or death vendetta with the most notorious crime lord in the galaxy because somebody didn't want to declare taxes on 3,000 kilos of cilantro. Everyone who pays a certain amount of attention to Star Wars knows this story already, but I was lucky enough to hear it recounted firsthand last year, so I'm gonna give it yet another retelling. So the husband and I were at Sci-Fi Weekender, a British-based annual sci-fi and fantasy convention last year, and one of the guests that year was Kevin J. Anderson, one of the very notable Star Wars Expanded Universe writers. During one of the events, a quiet little interview in a cafe on the event site, he fielded a question from an audience member about what it was like to write for a franchise like Star Wars, which often had a lot of cooks working on one broth, and he had the following to say, wording recounted as best as I can from memory. So in one of my stories, Han Solo, he travels to this asteroid planet called Kessel, which is where a lot of spice comes from, these spice mines of Kessel, and I got to really describe the effects of this spice, this terrible drug and the addiction and all this, and before publication, I get this call. I get this call from the lawyers, and they say, Kevin, you say in this story that spice is a drug. You can't say that. You can't say spice is a drug. And I say, what? What do you mean it's not a drug? Of course it's a drug. And they say, Han Solo used to smuggle spice. And you cannot, let us be clear, you cannot imply that the hero of Star Wars used to be a drug dealer. And I just stood there at a loss for words, and I eventually said, so what is it then? And they said to me, very sternly, it's a food additive. Now obviously this is ridiculous, and I won't back down, and they won't back down, and none of us will back down. And this book is very close to getting pulled, which I don't want because I worked hard on it, and they don't want because they already paid me in advance. And eventually, with this great air of superiority, they say, okay, Kevin, we'll take this to the top. We'll take this to George. And they go to all this trouble. This was a long while ago when such things were not so easy to arrange. They go to all this trouble to set up a conference call with all of them and me and with George Lucas. And they say, George, Kevin is trying to say in his new book that spice is a drug. It's a food additive. Tell him it's not a drug, George. And there's this long silence on the other end of the line. And eventually George says, it is a drug though. It's a drug. It's a food additive? What? Of course it's a drug. It's space heroin. What else would it be? What? And that was the end of that.